Okay, so today we're going to carry on with our next chapter. So our last chapter was looking at the fact that they were on the river, and then suddenly they'd gone onto the raft. Suddenly their fire had set fire. Their fire that they had made, the embers, had set fire to the rainforest, and that the rainforest was now on fire. There was smoke everywhere, and they just started down the raft after saving Max and Leela, who had fallen into the river. So we're going to start with on the river. It was almost completely dark when they found somewhere to moor, a place where the bank didn't rise too steeply from the river, and where the trees didn't look so much like an army ranged on the bank. Leela steered the raft towards land, and Fred jumped ashore. "I'll check there aren't any caiman marks," he said. "I'll come too," said Con. "No," said Max. He gripped her ankle. "Stay with me." Con flushed and swallowed a smile. She stayed. Fred walked through patches of trees, his heart beating in his ears, swinging a stick ahead of him through ferns, sniffing for the smell of anything recently killed. But it smelled only of growing things and of resin and birds. "It's fine," he called. "It's all safe." His voice twisted, echoing through the trees to reach the others, and they shouted instructions back to him and to each other and pushed the raft ashore. It didn't occur to anybody not to trust one another now, he thought. They had become a pack, or an expedition, he corrected himself. That was what you called a group of explorers. They slept that night on the forest floor, their backs touching. Though the day had been heavy with sun, the night was cloudless and cold, and Fred slept with his knees tucked up into his shirt. He found it was unexpectedly reassuring. Now, to feel Max's foot near his nose when he turned in the night. When the nightmares came, it was good to be able to hear the others breathing. They travelled on for another day and another night, the river carrying them at its own pace on its silver back. None of them spoke much. They watched the sides of the banks, waiting, alert, tense. On the morning of the third day, they had barely cast off when it started to rain. Max was sitting, staring out at the splashes rebounding on the river, when he let out a scream. "Sharks, Leela, sharks!" "Where?" Leela grabbed Max's arm. "Hold on to me, don't move." Fred looked around. There was only the expanse of water and the thrum of falling rain. "There are no sharks in the Amazon, Max," he said. "You don't have to worry." But even as his words were leaving his mouth, he saw what Max had seen, a fin rising up in the water. Con screamed. Leela let out a hiss. Fred froze. He said, speaking through rigid jaws, "Max, come away from the side of the raft." Then the fin dipped, disappeared, and cut out from the water, leapt an arc of a pinkish-grey body, curving against the rain and the thunder-coloured sun. "A dolphin," said Leela. Her whole face was transformed. Fred rubbed his eyes and looked again, but he hadn't imagined it. The dolphin was pink. The arc of pink was followed by another, dipping so that the half curve of its back rose out of the water, and another, then a puff of water from the dolphin's blowhole. They were coming closer. "Shall we jump in?" asked Fred. "Would they let us swim with them?" "Don't," said Con. There might be piranhas." The pod of dolphins circled the raft at a distance. There were 5 of them, Fred thought, or possibly 6. One leapt up clean out of the water, only 6 feet away. Max clapped and squealed. "Shh," said Leela. "We have to be quiet, Maxie. They're deciding if they trust us." It did seem that this was what the dolphins were doing. There was something speculative in the way they swam closer, doubling back and away, and closer again. Then, without warning, the pod turned and began to swim away. The grain grew thicker. Fred's heart lurched. He couldn't bear to see them go. He pulled off his shoes, stood up, and dived in, striking hard for the disappearing dolphins. As he neared them, 4 of the dolphins sped up and ducked deeper into the water, but one turned. Fred trod water. He held out his hand. He tried to stay as still as he could, and the dolphin swam up to him, a shape approaching under the water. He gasped and spat out water. It was rose-grey and covered in deep scars along its back. Its snout was lined with fierce-looking teeth, but its eyes were steady and soft. Fred tried to steady his breathing. It was the most astonishing thing he'd ever seen. It was like a battered river god. He held out his hand again. "Hello," he whispered. "I'm Fred." The dolphin dipped its nose to Fred's hand. He gasped at the surprising roughness of its skin. It buttered his hand, then huffed as if disappointed, and ducked down deep under the water. Fred watched, expecting its shadow to disappear, but as he turned back to the raft, the dolphin erupted from the water in front of him. It leapt clean over his head, showering him with spray, dipped down again, and disappeared. The others were shouting and beckoning from the raft. They hauled him up, all three of them trying to grab him at once. Fred couldn't speak, or he didn't want to. He wanted the memory to be sharp, carbon-copied onto his heart. He imagined his father's face when he told him. His heart sank and thumped in his chest, but the others were boiling over questions and ideas. "It was like he trusted you," said Con. "Or maybe it thought we were going to feed it," said Leela. "Maybe someone was feeding them with those sardines," said Fred. Later that day, just as Fred's head was beginning to swim with hunger, Leela spotted a fig tree on the shore. Fred climbed up and shook the fruit down onto the raft. They tied the sleeves and neck of his cricket jumper and made it into a sack. Max counted as he put them in. 120, 112, he said triumphantly. Behind him, Leah mouthed, 53. I always hated figs at school," said Com. "I thought they tasted like eating someone else's snot. But actually, they're the best thing in the world right now." Max fished a handful of figs out of the sack and pushed them into his pocket. "These ones are mine. I don't like sharing," he said haughtily. Leela fed one of the figs to Becca, who ate it hungrily, and half an hour later pooed lavishly onto her lap. She laughed and washed her skirt at the edge of the raft. "Sloths only go to the bathroom about once a week," she said, "so at least it's done it for a few days now." Becca looked thin and even more wide-eyed than usual. "They poo half their body weight each time," she said. "That sounds very stressful," said Com. The surface of the raft was constantly being washed with river water, so Leela draped the clean skirt over her shoulders to dry, travelling down the river like a floating scarecrow. Fred's shoes and shorts were sodden wet, but his shirt remained bone dry. The sun was hotter than 2 days put together. Con's cheeks and forehead grew bright pink with sunburn. Leela made her a cold compress out of weeds and plaited leaves, which leaked green water down over her eyebrows but eased some of the burning. That night, as they lay on a bed of fallen leaves, Becca moved across Leela's shoulders, sniffed at her neck, and climbed up Fred's calf. Sloths were nocturnal, and Becca seemed unusually sprightly by sloth standards. He fastened his arms and legs around Fred's knee and began to chew on his shorts. Fred lay still, trying not to move his leg as he looked up at the stars. They broke out in spirals and galloping animals and clustered like hordes of white butterflies ranging across the night. Leela was watching too. "Fred," she whispered, "are you awake?" "Yes," he whispered back. "The moon is so close." She sounded half asleep. "You could wear it as a hat." Fred nodded in the darkness but didn't speak. "At home," she whispered, you only ever get small squares of sky, however much you can fit between buildings and church spires." "Yes," whispered Fred, "I've never seen anything like this." Leela's voice grew even quieter. "Fred, are we going to be okay?" He kept staring up at the sky. "I don't know." Con stirred and turned to look at both of them. "Are you scared?" she whispered. "Yes," said Fred. He had never been so frightened in his life, but they were alive. He held that thought in his hand, tight against his skin. "Me too," Leela said. "Don't tell Max." "Me too," whispered Con. She gave a grunt of disgust. "But that's obvious. I can't work out how to hide it like you do." They lay breathing close to one another. "When this is over," said Leela, "let's all swear to meet again, somewhere." "Where?" asked Con. "Where's the most famous place to eat in London?" "The Ritz," said Fred. "Then we'll meet there," said Leela, "and we'll have one of every single kind of cake, and this will be like a dream." "And hot chocolate," murmured Max. He sounded 3/4 asleep. "Max," said Leela, "go back to sleep." Fred stole a look at the other three. Con had closed her eyes. Her brow was furrowed, but her lips had half a smile at the tips. On the fourth day, the river began to change. The trees arched densely overhead, and the water was choked with weeds. It no longer smelt fresh. Fish flitted through the reeds. "Are they piranhas?" said Con. "I mean, piranha." Leela peered down over the edge of the raft and nodded, her jaw set. She stroked Backer hanging around her neck and buried her chin into his fur. Her breath, as she exhaled, was shaky. It was mid-morning, but it grew dark as the branches thickened above them. "Is it just me, or does the river feel suddenly less on our side?" asked Con. "Not just you," said Fred shortly. His upper lip and forehead were dripping with sweat. The sweat wasn't only from the work of pooling, but he had Con's bark map in his pocket, and the thought of it warmed his chest, beating back against the cold doubt in his stomach. The current was in their favour, but travelling through the weeds was arm-aching, back-stretching, skin-shredding work. "Watch out!" called Leela. Fred flinched, looking around for something about to hit him in the face, then watched in silence as a snake slipped along a branch, spiralled up the trunk of a tree and disappeared into the green over their heads. Even Max didn't move. "It's almost certainly not deadly," said Fred. He winced. He'd intended it to sound reassuring, but instead his voice landed somewhere between desperately lying and stern aunt on a deathbed. He concentrated on doubling his speed until they were past the weeds, and they sped down the dark green passageway of overhanging trees. "We're close," said Fred. "On the map this river goes on until it meets a lake. I think it will be 3 or 4 hours, but it's hard to tell. And then there's a black square, and then a short line. That might be a path or a river, but could just be a squiggle, and then the X." Con reached into the water for the flattish stick as it floated by, and began to paddle. "The sooner we get there, the sooner we'll know the worst." The raft followed the river, Fred's pole splashing in his impatience to see what was around the next corner. He guided the raft around a floating fallen tree, traversed another 5 minutes of dark water, and found, without warning, that they had come to the mouth of a small lake. The lake was an exquisite blue, shining under a cloudless sky, but Fred did not notice. They all 4 sat crouched on the raft, looking up, their jaws open and their eyes wide. There was a long silence. Then Leela spoke. "Did I ever mention I'm terrified of heights?" Okay, we're going to leave it there at the minute. Okay, our next chapter is at the top of the cliff. So you obviously tune in next time to find out what's going to happen next.